So here, techniques for finding cases on Westlaw Next. In terms of on Lexis and Bloomberg, far less extensive and as a consequence probably straightforward with Lexis's. The headnotes and maybe the topic summaries and legal analysis. And likewise, the headnotes aren't especially extensive on Bloomberg, but they are there and you can click on the links. And of course, never forget to update, and update. And of course, with regard to cases, that's Shepard's and KeyCite or Bloomberg Cite B-Cite. And I neglected to mention a perfectly good strategy to start with cases is our good friend Google Scholar. Do keyword search there, and again, that may be a great way to find that first relevant or good case, and then dive in to Lexis and Westlaw. A lot of times in the assignments when I ask you to compare and contrast different resources, different strategies, many of you very astutely didn't use them in the exclusive. In other words, didn't suggest I only want to go on the web or I only want to go on a pay service. Many of you, as I said, very astutely, I might want to start on the web and then move over to Lexis or Westlaw. Most of you aren't thrilled with Bloomberg quite yet, so I don't know that anybody prefers Bloomberg quite yet. But and again, those for case finding especially, that's a great strategy. Start on Google, or if you liked FindLaw, as I showed you, or the court website LII. Again, for topical and keyword, I would definitely still go with Google Scholar first. And then, as I mentioned, find your cases, whatever cases you find. Remember, Shepard's KeyCite, B-Cite, Google Scholar is not quite there yet. They'll tell you what's cited, what cases have cited your case, but they won't tell you how those cases treated your case. And at least for the update portion of what you need to do, you really need to know how it's treated. So you really do need to go on to the pay services. Looking at the assignment, again, to continue our review, turning to page 2, there are a couple of aspects I wanted to highlight. Again, I can't emphasize enough, if you have a question about what I'm asking, don't hesitate to ask. So I'm pretty much asking you to go on Westlaw and use keywords and use the resources that we talked about that's in the handout. On question number 4, I ask you to, once you've found your topic and key number, to find additional cases. You'll want to do that. There are a couple of different approaches, and you get to choose whatever works. There's the really advanced search that I showed you on one side of the handout, or there's just using the key number filters that's on the left side of Westlaw once you find your case results using a keyword search. Either one of those is okay. Use whichever one you think is better. Again, on question 5, I ask you to use the topic analysis. That's the Westlaw key number search. The topic, it's called the topic analysis. What I refer to as the table of contents of key numbers. And again, on our first screen on Westlaw, it's just right here. And hopefully by that question you should have had a topic and key number so you could look at the topic analysis. You can also find it in many other ways as well. The key number filter, once you have search results, also will show you some of the possible. As I mentioned on Lexis, it's pretty much just the headnotes, the topic summaries, and the legal issue trail. Interestingly, and actually Helena discovered this, not all Lexis cases have headnotes. And what Helena discovered in doing the workshop is that there was one of the cases, actually a relevant case to our attorney research malpractice question, that had what looked like a headnote, but it wasn't linked. And I found out the answer, Helena, as to why that is, and that is that headnote actually is a headnote that's in the official state reports. So if you were to go to the books, you would find that headnote, and I forget the exact text of it, it might have been attorney malpractice. And And apparently, I also learned that Lexis, on very short cases, doesn't include its own Lexis headnote analysis. Yeah, I would consider that as a reason to not prefer Lexis if they don't have headnotes on cases that you're looking for. That's true for Westlaw only to the extent that they're non-reported cases, and this I'm not sure of. There may even be non-reported cases that do have the Westlaw headnotes. I won't swear to that, but for reported cases, Westlaw. And as I said, Westlaw has been at the headnote business a whole lot longer, but nonetheless. So just as a little aside, if you run into a Lexis case without headnotes, it's not your computer not working, which is what I thought at first, and was definitely not correct in that. Okay, so that's again using a little bit more of the logistics on using the different topical systems. On question D on page 3, I'm asking you to compare and evaluate the key number headnote searching, and I lump them together with your terms and connectors. I'm asking you to do a terms and connector search, and also with field searching. And by field searching, I mean the Synopsys Digest. So that's really the only field searching technique that we have. Lexis and Bloomberg don't really have field searching, or obviously Google Scholar don't really have field searching capabilities. Okay. Hopefully, I've then talked about Shepard's and Keysight, and I guess the other highlight I should mention in terms of a cases review, Shepard's, Keysight, B-Site, critical for updating, but also excellent tools for researching, for finding additional cases on a particular topic. And the other thing I want to remind you about updating on cases, when you see the red flag or the red stop sign, don't automatically assume, oh, I can't use that case. It's very possible that case was overruled on one issue within the case, but not on the other issues. Sometimes the later case will indicate affirmed in part, reversed in part, but not. You want to look at whatever is causing your case to be negated, to be overruled or reversed, and see if whatever your point of law is still valid. So that's an important concept for updating. Any questions regarding cases, case finding? Okay, so let's move on to administrative materials. Now, from what I gather, you all have either taken or are taking administrative law. Okay, so that's good. So you've had or are having some introduction. I can't tell you how many attorneys, now these are practicing attorneys, licensed, passed the bar and everything, who don't know about the existence of regulations or what they are. And as a librarian, that's a little scary. That's why that legal malpractice and research question comes up in my mind now and again. So I'm going to start with the basics, and this is probably a review for you at this point, since as you have said, you are have taken or are taking ad law. So we've moved now from the legislative branch to the judicial branch, and now we're finishing up with our third branch, the executive branch. And actually the executive branch I think of really in two parts, although it's not technically correct, so don't quote that to anybody. And basically those two parts are the presidential part, or what documents the president's office issues, and then there are the agencies. Now they're all within the executive branch, so don't think I'm suggesting otherwise. But we are going to look at both parts, and they are very different. The regulations, of course, are far more common than what the executive, what the president issues. Although, interestingly, as you've probably been hearing in the news, the president can have considerable sway on what goes on in terms of what the practice is in terms of immigration. You've heard about the president's. Interestingly, it's being called executive orders, I believe, and I may be wrong about this, they're actually technically executive actions. And we'll actually look at that next time when we talk about the presidential materials. Today we're going to focus on the agency materials. So within the executive branch, as you can see from our sources of the law handout, the patterns remain sort of the same. We start with chronological publication of regulations and executive actions, so both what the agencies promulgate as well as what the president issues. And we'll talk about these publications on the federal and New York State. And then those chronological publications get transferred into a subject compilation of regulations and executive actions. And that, of course, is called a code. And we'll be looking at the Federal Code of Federal Regulations this time, and next class we'll be looking at New York State's NYCRR. Okay, so we're going to focus, as I mentioned, on the agencies today, and of course the agencies issue or promulgate regulations, and there are any number of places. This is USA.gov, this website, and it gives you a nice breakdown, which is why I like it. So of the executive office of the president, as opposed to, at least on this page, the different executive departments. So this is pretty much the president's cabinet, give or take, and then in addition to, within those executive departments, and then in addition to the independent agencies, on this other page at USA.gov, you get a nice sense of just how many federal agencies are out there promulgating regulations. And regulations have the force of law. As we learned when we talked about authority, statutes have greater authority than regulations. So if there's a conflict between a statutory section and a regulation, the statutory section would control. But many, if not most, of this long list of agencies are promulgating these regulations. And you want to keep, in addition to regulations, as you've all learned in are learning in administrative law, and probably can give more detail at this point than I can, these agencies also have the ability to adjudicate. And they're referred to as quasi-judicial decisions. There are administrative law judges, and that's what they're called, within these different agencies who will hear disputes between parties. The decisions they issue tend not to have any precedential value outside of the parties. But again, I would refer you to the Administrative Procedure Act for how all of that works. And we'll be talking about administrative decisions, hopefully later on today, but if not, then next class, in terms of how to research them. So essentially what we're talking about overall with these regulations, and going back to the sources of law, is the legislature. Congress, the state legislature, basically realizes that, or comes to the conclusion, we need to legislate in a particular area. Say we need to legislate because we need to clean up the air or clean up the water, or we're worried about carbon dioxide emissions, for those of you who follow the global warming discussions. So Congress, or the state legislature in whatever state, passes a law. Gets stamped on the head, the whole thing. We need clean air. But Congress realizes, okay, we not only do not have the expertise to understand exactly how to, exactly all the details of how to clean up the air, but frankly, we don't have the manpower or the time. So they delegate their authority within the Clean Air Act, within the Clean Water Act, within whatever piece of legislation we're talking about. So within the United States Code, you will find sections delegating authority to a particular agency saying, hey, agency, you figure out how many parts per billion it's safe to have arsenic in the water. And you determine what the maximum amount of arsenic is safe to have in the water, and fill in the blank for any other chemical. And likewise, you determine on health aspect how you want this whole new health law, the Affordable Care Act, and how all that's going to work, and these exchanges and all the details. And some of these, the legislation, the acts themselves can be thousands of pages, and then they delegate their authority to the relevant various agencies to promulgate these regulations. And of course, that whole process is governed by the Administrative Procedure Act, as you have all studied. I distributed what I thought was an interesting article from basically June, I think it was, so 8 months ago, give or take, from the Washington Post. Interesting in that it illustrates the intersection between the three branches and how this delegation can come up in litigation, and consequently some of the aspects when you are dealing with regulations that you always need to be aware of. And so, of course, this is a Supreme Court opinion regarding the Clean Air Act and regarding air pollution and the EPA. And you'll see one of the places I underlined decision, this referring to a different decision this term that upheld the EPA's authority to regulate air pollution. So here's the intersection, as I was talking about. The Congress passes whatever legislation it passes, it gets signed by the president, becomes law, and Congress delegates authority. Hey, EPA, you figure out how to deal with the details of how to deal with air pollution. The EPA issues regulations, and of course, they may issue regulations that certain parts of society or business find objectionable because it's going to cost them money, or it's going to make whatever it is they do more difficult. They object to it ideologically, whatever their reasons. So people will say, hey, wait a minute, EPA, you really don't have the authority to regulate carbon dioxide emissions. The way the Clean Air Act is written, it doesn't mention anything about carbon dioxide. And then that goes to the court, and as it turned out, the court actually, in several different decisions and several different aspects of this litigation, pretty much said, yeah, the EPA actually does have some authority to regulate the emission of carbon dioxide. Actually, that started out, you'll see on page 2 in 2007, there was a Supreme Court decision. But anyway, this article, as I mentioned, is an interesting illustration of the interaction between the three different branches. Okay. And as I mentioned, this also can be somewhat of have political ramifications. And as promised, have a Daily Show clip. We'll see how well it comes up. We have to refresh. All right.
Did you push play yet, though?
Yeah, I'm going to have to refresh, which means we're going to have to sit. Oh, there we go.
Nothing but bitter stalemate. It's easy to forget that it was just 1 year ago that Washington actually got something done. The Dodd-Frank Act. A complete overhaul of the regulations governing our financial system, intended to ensure that we would never again suffer another 2008-style meltdown. These reforms represent the strongest consumer financial protections in history. And these protections will be enforced by a new consumer watchdog with just one job: looking out for people, not big banks, not lenders, not investment houses, looking out for people. What? Wait, who? Who were we looking out for before? Anyway, the Dodd-Frank Act is now 1 year old. And here to discuss the effect it's having in reforming a damaged financial system, we're very lucky to have with us tonight H.R. 4173, the Dodd-Frank Act, everybody!
And you thought I was crazy in liking this.
Congress passed me without a single song. I make sure Wall Street plays by the new regulations.
protecting your investments across the entire nation.
Just hang on there 1 second. What? I'm sorry, Dodd-Frank. What the hell happened to you?
What do you mean?
I don't want to say it, but you look like...
Hey, easy. Washington's a tough town, John. Since getting past, yeah, I've taken a few shots, but I'm still standing. Yeah, yes, I'm still standing. I'm still here. In fact, just last week, my all-new Consumer Financial Protection Board opened for business. As soon as it gets a director, we'll be off to the races.
So wait, there's no director?
No, not just yet.
It's been a year.
Come on.
What about Elizabeth Warren? Wasn't she supposed to be the director of this thing? What happened there?
Confirmation in the Senate, there's no motion. Obama could have used a recess appointment to give up the job without a vote, but he didn't do it because his feelings weren't that strong.
Wow.
But you know what?
That's interesting.
You know what, John? It doesn't matter. I've still got 400 tough new rules to remake our broken and corrupt financial system.
Well, you know what? That's great. How are those new 400 rules working?
They're working great. The ones that are written are working great.
The ones that are... How many of those 400 new rules have been written?
38. It's a magic number. Yes, it is. Oh, it's a magic number. It might not be 400 or 150 or 77, but it's 38. And that's a magic number. Let's do this. Red Sox pitcher Kurt Schilling. LA Clippers forward their Wilson. Bonders tailback. Richie Williams, they walk 38. And it's a magic number. Oh, it's a magic number.
I'm sorry, but 38 is a magic number because Dale Wilkinson makes it a magic number?
You've heard of Dale Wilkinson?
No, I have not. The Clippers guy, until you mentioned him just now. No, I have not
You
heard of him.
just have to take my word for it. He definitely exists.
Why weren't the rules written, John?
Strictly. Lobby, 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 get your access here. Lobby, 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 get your access here. Lobby, lobby, that's your... Stop it, hold it, I can't do this. Blaming lobbyists is a cop-out, John. Here's what's going down. This whole financial reform thing is a sham. The only way the Congress would pass me was if the details of my rules and regulations were left unspecified, giving K Street lobbyists all the time they would need to water me down post-passage. And you know what? Exactly, boo, exactly. Thank you, boys and girls, thank you. And you know what? If any actual tough rule managed to squeak through, Congress people cut the budget of the agency responsible for enforcing it. The whole thing is a giant punt. I'm no law. I'm no law, John. I'm just an undefined, impotent, 2,300-page piece of legislation.
Anyway, we won't go any further since I don't want to offend anybody. But it gives you a hopefully fun and funny picture, and actually pretty good of the relationship between the legislative process and the regulatory process, as well as how politics and interest groups also have their say and influence in the process. So what I am describing to you, both in the process of what goes on in terms of delegating authority, as well as we look at these various aspects of where regulations are published and how they work, this is a simplified version. It works for a lot of what goes on in terms of administrative materials and regulatory process, but there actually also probably as many anomalies as there are cases where they follow the general pattern. So I say that because you will, as you do your workshop, as you do your assignment, as you do research in regulatory areas, all of a sudden you'll find, but wait a minute, this isn't how it's supposed to work, and yet this is one of those anomalies. I've been running into that a couple of times today, looking at various aspects of other regulations. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about the process overall, how it works, how it might not work, as we saw with John Oliver. Let's now dive into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty. Once you know you're in a regulatory area, how are you going to find these regulations? Basically, just as we've talked about with cases, just as we talked about with statutes, probably one of the better ways are secondary sources. Now, you may or may not have run into references to regulations when you're looking at secondary sources for your assignment, but a lot of, when you are in a regulatory area where the regulations are important, hopefully you will encounter them. You also will run into some references in annotated codes. So here I've pulled up the section we were talking about last time, 29 U.S.C. 1132. And at least here on Westlaw, when, again, because regulations are promulgated as part of a statutory scheme, within some sections, and this is, again, inconsistent, here on Westlaw, if you go to Context and Analysis, what you'll notice is the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, what I have found with the annotated code references to the Code of Federal Regulations, and again, the Code of Federal Regulations is where you're going to find the current, as we saw in the sources of the law. It's worth backing up just a moment here. The subject compilation, Code of Federal Regulations. So this is where, just like we find the current statutes in the U.S. Code, you find the current regulations in the Code of Federal Regulations. Again, we're talking federal. And it is a subject compilation, so it's a topical arrangement. So back here on Westlaw, we went to Context and Analysis. We clicked on Code of Federal Regulations, because we now know that's where you find current regulations. And we see references here. And what I typically find in statutory, actually in any reference to regulations, secondary source, statutory, if you happen to be reading a case, even that refers to regulations, which many cases do. Many cases revolve around regulations, as we just saw. You won't get a precise, hey, this is the section you should look at, and that's actually the section you should look at. What you'll get is a reference to hopefully relevant sections. Sometimes you'll get references to totally irrelevant sections. And especially with the Code of Federal Regulations, you thought I was waxing poetic about tables of contents, the secondary sources, and statutes. Well, I'm going to be even worse with the Code of Federal Regulations. It's absolutely necessary. Once in a great while, in my opinion, you'll get very lucky and get the exact right section. But actually, maybe even if you get the exact right section, maybe there are other relevant sections in addition to the great section that you need to know about. So the moral of the story is, take a look in the annotated codes, but don't expect, okay, I'm done, I found the CFR section, because first of all, it may not be the relevant one. Second of all, it may not be the only relevant one. So again, you want to take the annotated code, secondary source advice, and then look in the relevant portions of the Code of Federal Regulations, and the way you do that is through the table of contents. So here we notice we've got Title 29, and we'll take a look in more detail at the CFR and what all the titles and numbers mean in a little while. But rules for regulations, administrative enforcement, that sounds like that could be promising. And so again, from the annotated code, you get reference. And this is true in print, USCA. Taking a quick look at Lexis, again, same exact section, works a little bit differently. Again, I go to the good old jump to, and again in the research references. So if you think about it, if you're getting reference to the Code of Federal Regulations, hopefully it makes a little bit of sense. And again, you get a link, and it turns out it's the same section. Frequently in annotated codes, you won't get any CFR reference. So if we were looking at our favorite section 1144, at least on Westlaw, we wouldn't get any CFR reference. On Lexis, I believe you do. The USCS, I timed out. The USCS tends to give a few more CFR references, I find, than the USCA. But again, you can't count on it, but might as well take advantage if you do find it. Again, with the caveats that it'll get you started into hopefully a relevant area of the CFR, but maybe not the best area or maybe not the only best area. Okay. Keyword searching can be okay, but the regulations have similar difficulties with keyword searching as statutes, and then some because of that specialized terminology. If you think there's specialized terminology in statutes where Congress carefully chose their words, it's even more so with the regulations. So what that means is unless you already know the correct terminology that's used in the regulation, your keyword searching may or may not pull up the relevant, a relevant, or all of the relevant regulations. So by looking at the table of contents, and since we're here at Lexis, I'll start to talk a little bit about that. So we see Twin 9, and then we see the gradual breakdown of the title. The CFR is broken up into titles the same way the U.S. Code is. However, the titles don't always correspond. So we're looking at Title 29 in the CFR, which is labor, which is also the labor title in the U.S. Code. So they sometimes correspond, but you can't count on it. So if you know you're interested in Title 42 of the U.S. Code, you can't count on the fact that that's going to be Title 42 in the CFR. As I said, there are a couple of titles that do, but not all of them. And so we see gradually the breakdown. I wouldn't worry too much about the terminology, subtitle, chapter, subchapter. Just what you want to do as you start to look through is to start to figure out, all right, where is the cutoff where it's going to be relevant to me? And sometimes actually what I like to do is work my way up. So I'm starting here from this section. We haven't read it yet. It may or may not be relevant. So part, and we'll talk about parts in just a little bit, 2560's rules and regulations for administration of enforcement of moving a level up, the Employee Retirement Security Active, so of ERISA, and that is part of Employee Benefit Security Administration, Department of Labor. So that's definitely all of interest. When we get one step up, we have regulations regarding labor. Now that gets a little too general, right? Because there could be all sorts of regulations having to do with organized labor that have nothing to do with what we're interested in. So really the commonality is here. So I'm probably going to want to look at the table of contents from chapter XXV or 25. And I mean, it looks pretty similar. You can do the same thing here on Westlaw and work your way back up the chain of the hierarchy of your section. There is an index to the Code of Federal Regulations. Typically, most research guides will tell you, the index is not great. Actually, for the officially published CFR, it's only one volume. So you imagine all the millions of regulations, and I believe there are millions of regulations. One single index isn't going to get you very much detail. But interestingly, let's take a look at the handout. We start with the index on page 1. And this is the old-fashioned CFR print index. And here is just an example where a print index, even one that's not particularly well thought of, actually probably would have been the easiest way to find references to the relevant regulations for our ERISA issue. You could have tried keyword searching, and I, at least, as I was trying various keyword searches that we've done, liability, HMO, preemption, I wasn't, depending on which service you use, you might come up with some relevant, you might not come up, especially with the natural language. Well, terms and connectors too, actually. Whereas when you already know your issue, we already know we're talking about ERISA, so looking on page 2 at Employee Retirement Income Security, it refers us to pensions. So turning to page 3, I turn to pensions in the index, and I just scan down the index. And typically when I'm using an index, once I get to a particular area, I'll just scan through. I might try to guess what to look under, but again, I don't know the terminology that's in the regulations yet. Unfortunately, you don't know the terminology till you've found the regulation. So it's sort of a chicken and egg problem. So I'll just scan down and I notice, oh look, Employee Retirement Income Security Act. And underneath that, I'll see group health plan requirements. I know our clients in a group health plan, so I might want to look at 29, Title 29 CFR, and again, this is a reference to a part. We saw a little bit in that hierarchy, the part is sort of one step up from the regulation section itself. So I'm definitely going to check Part 2590. Another tool in the index, if you remember, I think most people probably don't, but it's actually kind of nice if you do. And I'll show you where all of this is online in a moment. And actually all of these pages from the CFR that we're looking at, I actually downloaded from the FedSys site. And we'll be looking at that in just a couple of minutes. So here is this on page 4, parallel table of authority and rules. If you know your USC section, this table actually translates for you into CFR sections. So turning on page 5, I turned in this table to Title 29 because we know our sections of interest. And then I just scanned within Title 29 and I found, you'll see the handy dandy arrow on the right, 1132, and it actually refers us to somewhat different parts. Notice 2560, 2570, 2571. There's nothing for 1144, although interestingly, as we will see, there is a CFR section that talks about preemption. So again, with the CFR especially, you can't rely on just one particular reference source. And that's again where that table of contents and going up the levels to your relevant either part, subpart, subsection, in our case, chapter 25, is going to be necessary. Okay, so that's a little bit on finding, how to find sections of the CFR. And those are a lot of the strategies that we've been talking about throughout. There's certain aspects that you're going to want to understand depending on what your issue is. If, for instance, you are suing an agency saying, hey, agency, you exceeded the authority that Congress or the state legislature granted you, there are aspects that we'll look at within the CFR, and again, next time within the state's regulations. So let's jump over as promised. So here's FedSys, and again, here's where I found essentially the print CFR. It's PDF, so it's essentially a scan, or it's really a scan, but I like to think of it as a photograph of what you're looking at in print. So yes, going on Lexis and Westlaw, obviously we found the CFR quite easily, but this is a free resource, so again, depending on what information you have, I wouldn't start searching here because the search capability on FedSys isn't very sophisticated at all, but certainly if you already have a citation, I might start here. And again, this also is the official, whereas Lexis and Westlaw obviously are not. So here you can see the page that we started at when we looked at the US Code and we looked at the public laws. We're now just going to jump up here to the CFR. And clicking on the CFR, as you can see, I already used the drop down to choose 2015. Now again, remember we're talking about print, and notice for 2015 we jump around. We go 1, 5, 6, and then it ends at 14. If we choose 2014 instead, and again I just pre-opened this up so we don't have to watch it load, then notice we see Title 1, Title 2, and it goes in order all the way down, as I mentioned, broken up. There's Title 29, which we'll go back to in a moment. So 50 titles in the CFR, again divided up into different subject areas. Some of the titles correspond to the USC, some do not, so don't count on it. But luckily for us, Title 29 is the labor title in both sets. So let's go back to the handout now, and essentially on the handout, what we're looking at is exactly what I clicked through to download from FedSys. But again, rather than watching the computer load, I thought this might be easier so that you could see it a little closely, and also I could add my handy dandy little arrows to highlight. So essentially all I doing was taking my advice, and let's take a look at the table of contents. We worked our way up, and we know that chapter 25 is probably the highest level that we're interested in. So we looked at, basically I did that online, but I could also just scan through the table of contents in print and scan through the various chapters to see which are of interest. So that's on page 7. And also, I don't know if you noticed when we were looking at the various indexes, are the parts that we were interested in. 2590 we got a reference to, 2550 I think, 2571. Notice they all start with 25. The numbering system in the CFR is wonderfully logical once you understand what the numbers are telling us. So that number, when I see that 2590, I can kind of guess that chapter 25 is of interest. So let's turn the page, go to page 8. So I'm now looking at the table of contents for chapter 25 and looking at those various parts. And basically the parts are just the name for the subdivisions of chapter 25. As you can see, chapter 25 is fairly involved, so that there are sub-chapters. And you sometimes will see references to the sub-chapters, but what you're really interested in is the part. So what I would do, have done actually, is take my own advice and look at the table of contents and say, okay, which of these parts look of interest? Well, 2510 definitions, the minute I see definitions, I'm going to take a look. They may or may not be relevant, but I definitely want to take a look. Scanning down, another part we saw reference, I think, in one of the indexes, 2560, Rules and Regulations for Administration and Enforcement. We saw a reference to either 2570 or 71, procedural regulations, maybe not. And then again on page 9, scanning down, we see another part number that we're interested in, 2590, which we had seen reference to in that table. But if I hadn't remembered that table, again, either from an index or again scanning from the table of contents. And again, that I would have hopefully recognized that group health plans were of interest. Okay, let's turn the page, page 10, and let's take a closer look at a couple of the subparts. A couple of the parts. So I mentioned, I see definitions, I'm always going to want to take a look at that part, at whatever is referring me to definitions. So 2510 was the first part, and within turning the page to the beginning of part 2510, what I see is a table of contents of those sections within 2510. So I can scan through the various definitions that might be of interest. And just a little bit of nomenclature here, the section number, obviously, so the CFR, the actual section number, there are, I don't know, a handful, 10 or so listed here, 2510.3-1. That's the actual section. That's the citation that you would probably see in a case if there was a dispute about what that section meant. And the section name, at least for the 2510.3-1, is Employee Welfare Benefit Plan. So the section name for 2510.3-21 is Definition of Fiduciary. So just so you get the nomenclature down as we refer to these various aspects of the CFR. Okay, looking at my next handy dandy arrow, that is the word section with S in parentheses. My pen got a little funky, so I know it kind of looks like a 5 there. But really the authority, and you will see an authority note in the CFR either after the table of contents for the part, or sometimes you will see an authority note after the actual section itself. And the authority tells you just what it sounds like. Where in the USC is the authority for the agency to promulgate these regulations? And again, sometimes that can be the issue that's litigated. I don't know if you remember, it's probably a while back now. I think it was the FDA promulgated regulations regarding cigarette advertising. I think it's cigarette advertising on packages. Ultimately, the tobacco companies brought the FDA to court, and ultimately the court found that the FDA had exceeded its authority for whatever these regulations that the FDA had promulgated regarding cigarettes and tobacco products. So what the tobacco companies did was they argued to the court, hey, look in the USC under the authority listed here. The USC doesn't give the FDA authority to do whatever the regulations were doing. And actually the EPA case that we were looking at in the Washington Post, some of those cases that referenced in that article, there were actually, the article was about one case and there were a couple of other cases referenced. Some of those cases did the same thing. They questioned, the coal companies, I think actually, questioned the EPA's authority to issue the regulations that the EPA issued. So that's what that authority is, and that's why it's so important. So you can actually see a whole bunch of different sources of authority within the USC for the regulations, the regulation sections in Part 2590. Any questions about authority? And once we get past the, question?
So they include that, the authority section in each part?
Typically, the authority will be for the part, because typically an agency will issue a series of regulations around a particular area. So in this case, actually, probably the authority, we'll see different parts having similar authority because the agency issued a whole range or host of different aspects of regulations having to do with ERISA. So as we saw, there are a whole bunch of parts under. Actually, let's take a look. I may be able to answer your question better looking. Let's look back at page 8. Basically, the Department of Labor, the Employee Benefit Security Administration, issued, as you can see, I don't know, it's a half a dozen, probably closer to a dozen different parts, different aspects of regulations and how to implement ERISA. And these different parts cover different aspects of ERISA. So Part 2510 talks about definitions, 2530, rules and regulations for minimum standards for employee pension benefit plans. Of course, we're not interested in that part, but we might be interested in 2560, rules and regulations for administration and enforcement. And as we went through the different parts that we might be interested in. So the authority would be for those parts. Now, because all these parts are related, they may have the same authority. What might happen, however, is after the regulations are initially promulgated, so it's the first time they've come out in whatever year and time that happens, regulations may get added later. So they might have the same authority because they might come within the overall, for instance, the Clean Air Act or Clean Water Act are great examples. They were passed 70s, I think, and there have been regulations issued after they were initially passed and then for the last 35, 40 years. So they will probably go back to the same authority, and then the question comes in, does that really fall in the authority that existed in the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act? Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Got a little broader, I think, than you had intended, but okay. So that's the authority, and then we see on page 10 still the actual section 2510.3-1, Employee Welfare Benefit Plans. Let's now turn to a slightly more complex part. So we're looking at 2510, and as I said, that was like 8 or 10 sections. Part 2590, which we also identified since it has to do with group health plans as of interest, has a whole lot more sections and a slightly more involved table of contents. And again, in the beginning of the part in the CFR, we see the table of contents and the various sections that might be of interest. So we didn't even get a reference to a specific section the way we did in the index. We just got sent to 2590, which actually is better because we might be interested in any of these sections. Back in Westlaw, remember in this context and analysis, we got sent to this specific section, 2560.502-1, which may be of interest, but it didn't get us to 2590 or any of these potentially interesting sections or sections of interest. And just going down, you see the different section numbers and the section names. So you might see, for instance, as you scan through on the right-hand side, and this doesn't have much to do with our issue, but it may be of interest to those of you still on your parents' plan, 2590.715-2714, eligibility of children until at least age 26. So here is actually a source of where it says that you can still be on your, for those people who are still on their parents' plan, at least until 26. And I think that was actually added after the Affordable Care Act, although I'm not sure about that. But more relevant to our client's issue, perhaps 2590.715-2719, internal claims and appeals and external review process. Maybe we want to find out more about our client, what our client did to have her case reviewed by the health plan, and if she appealed, and maybe we want to make an argument that her health plan didn't follow these regulations. And so maybe we find liability in a different way. Rather than saying they broke the rules by denying her coverage, we might say they broke the rules because they didn't follow the right process in the C that are in the regulations. And as I mentioned, another section that might be of interest that we didn't see referenced anywhere else, either in the index or from Lexis or Westlaw in their references, 2590.731, preemption, state flexibility construction. So again, we see the authority for Part 2590 in the various sections in the U.S. Code. And below that, we see source. And what the source is telling us is where these regulations were initially published in the Federal Register. And the Federal Register is the chronological compilation of regulations, and I'll talk more about the federal regulation in just a little while. But note here, just for the moment, that we see underneath the part table of contents, we see source 62 FR, Federal Register, so that's volume and page, date April 8th, 1997, unless otherwise notice. So this is the source for Part 2590. I forgot to write for 2590, so add that on your handout if you would, and I'll do that next time. The unless otherwise noted means that this is the source. Related to your question, so this is the source for all of these different sections, just as this is the authority for all of these different sections. However, as we go forward and look at some of these sections, some might have been added after 1997, some might have been amended or changed somehow after 97, and we'll see the source for that particular section after the section. So why don't we turn the page? Actually, we won't see it quite yet, but I will highlight it for you because I want to highlight some of what the regulations might be of interest. So I had mentioned internal claims, appeals, and external review process. So that's 2590.715-2519, and notice there's those definition sections for the purposes of this section. The definitions apply. And we see the definition of appeal or internal appeal, turning the page to page 13, minimum internal claims and appeals standards. So again, even though we hadn't even investigated this whole theory for how we might help our client, by looking through the table of contents and investigating some of these sections, maybe we're now coming upon another theory in which we could help our client. And turning to page 14, as promised, what you will see is the source for the specific section, not the whole part, but just our one section, 2590-715, I'm sorry, .715-2719A. And yes, these regulation section numbers can get a little involved. You just have to follow it methodically and slowly to keep track of it all. And so what we see is actually this section wasn't promulgated in 1997. It was promulgated in 2010. So this is the source for the specific section, as I mentioned. Any questions about the difference, finding the sources? And I'll explain why you care about the source in just a little bit. And turning the page to page 15. So here we are in part 2590, and because 2590 is a lot more involved, it's divided up into subparts. And it turns out subpart D, as you can see on page 15, has its own source. So again, it's a little bit involved and hopefully not too confusing, but again, just using our theme of being bibliographically aware and looking at whatever part you're interested in, section you're interested in, and whatever subpart your section might be a part of. If it's complex enough, you'll find the information that you might need. So again, we're looking at the source for what's in subpart, the various sections in subpart D, one of which is that section on preemption, 2590.731. And interestingly, turning the page to page 16, we notice a reference that I've underlined, provisions of section 514 of the Act. And that might sound familiar, I hope, because we've been looking at, remember way back when we looked at ERISA and we looked at Public Law 93406, and turns out 514 was the section that enacted the preemption section, which got codified as section 1144. And looking down at page 16, again, we see the source for this particular section. So that's even different than the subpart. So what I say, when you're looking for the source, what I suggest, again, you start at the section level. See if there's a source for your section. If there's not a source for your section, see if there's a source for the subpart or part that it's underneath or a part of, using that word too much. And you will find at the very least a source for the part. Okay. Before we talk about the Federal Register, let's take a look online. Because of course here we've pulled up, now this is a different section, but certainly one of possible interest, 2560.502-1, request for enforcement. The problem with the CFR, unlike our friend, the U.S. Code Annotated and U.S. Code Service, is the CFR is not an annotated code. If you look at the CFR on FedSys, if you go into it down to a section level, or you actually pull the book off the shelf, you will not see any editorial enhancements. You will not see any notes of decisions, case notes, annotations, references. So that's where going online to the pay services, that's where you actually get some of what you pay for in these services. So for finding cases that interpret CFR sections, and as we will see next time for state regulatory sections, here on Westlaw, if there were any, you'd see in the notes of decisions for this particular section there aren't any, but again, you just click on the tab. But you also might want to check citing references. And you'll notice there are actually cases that cite to the section. I guess they're not in the notice of decisions because they don't talk about the section in any depth. You'll also notice administrative decisions and guidance. We'll talk about these later, but again, these are those decisions issued by those administrative law judges that work for the agency. These are not court judge decisions. And similarly on Lexis, so our section, Lexis as usual looks a little different. If we could do the jump to, or I'm just going to scroll down. Oh, and I should highlight, you'll see both the authority as well as the source on both Lexis and Westlaw at the end of this section as well. And if you scroll down on Lexis, there actually are case notes on Lexis. So interestingly, Lexis has a bit more editorial enhancement for this section than did Westlaw. And actually, I shouldn't leave out Bloomberg. If we pull up, and hopefully I'm still logged in. Oh, actually, I want CFR. 2560.502-1. And I'm going to do a citation search. And Bloomberg has a case analysis tab. I don't even know if they have anything listed. Any questions about using the quote-unquote annotated codes on Lexis, Westlaw, Bloomberg? Again, you're not going to find that in FedSys. Again, you're just going to find the scan or picture, whichever concept you prefer, of the CFR. Okay, so I've been talking about the Federal Register and the source without really explaining why we care. So as I'm going to go back here to sources. So as we talked about, and as you learned about and probably know more about than I do, in the Administrative Procedure Act, actually let me step back a little bit because this, I told you in the first class that I wouldn't do much history, but this is sort of interesting, especially since you do have the ad law background. Did you talk about the hot oil case? Also known as the Panama refining case?
Conmol.
Oh, okay. So the reason it's of interest to...
Same class, I don't remember any of that.
The reason I mention it is that it was apparently in that case, or going through the court, some part of that case, this was in the 1930s, made it to the Supreme Court relying on a regulation, even though that regulation had been revoked before the case initially was filed. So this, of course, caused some consternation of the Supreme Court wasting their time, not to mention the other courts, not to mention probably a little bit embarrassment for the parties. And this got to the attention of Congress. So in 1935, the Congress passed the Federal Register Act. And in the Federal Register Act, preceding the APA, Administrative Procedure Act, the Federal Register Act required publication of a variety of executive and administrative documents, including agency rulemaking. And of course, as you all know, the Administrative Procedure Act came about in the 1940s, about a decade later, giving the public right to participate in rulemaking, requiring a notice of proposed rulemaking, and requiring that these notices and the proposed rulemakings appear in the Federal Register. And this is leading up to why we care about the Federal Register, I do promise. So now in the Federal Register, we find a whole lot of interesting information. We do find some of those executive presidential documents that we'll talk about next time, executive actions, presidential actions, orders, proclamations, and we will also find proposed, it's where the agencies must publish any rules that they're going to propose. It's where they must publish notice of rulemakings to give the public opportunity to issue comments. We'll talk about how to see comments in a little bit, where that's possible, not entirely. Comments aren't actually published in the Federal Register. That would take up acres and acres and acres of space, because in some controversial rules there are literally hundreds of thousands of comments that are filed. And then ultimately, of course, the agency publishes the final rule in the Federal Register. And in addition to the final rule, what the agency publishes is some discussion of how they came to determine what the final rule will be. Does that sound familiar at all? Does it sound like anything we've talked about in another section of the course? Why the agency decided on,
Legislative history.
so in the Federal Register is where you will find any regulatory history that might exist. Now, the nice thing about it, it's all in one place. It's not like legislative history. You have to figure out reports and congressional record and bills and hearings and all of that. I'm not going to ask you to do any charts for administrative materials. But that's why you want to know the source. When you are looking at a particular CFR section, and also true for state regulations as well, and you want to know, how is it they came about to decide upon this particular rule or this particular language? You'll want to go to the source, and again, for the federal regulations, that source is going to be the Federal Register. And you get that citation, whether it's underneath the section itself or underneath the part table of contents. So looking on page 17, actually, let's just go back because I neglected to highlight a connection for you, so I'll do it backwards if, where did it go here? So we were looking at the source for one of the CFR sections that we were interested in. So on page 16, we don't even have to go back that far, good. Page 16, looking at one of the sections, 2590.731, at the end we see the source, and we see the citation, 69 FR 78778. So just remember that number or jot it down if you're like me and you have a terrible memory. And note also the date. When you're dealing with the Federal Register, you're actually much better getting the date than you are the volume number, because you'll find the Federal Register by date rather than volume number. So December 30, 2004. So that's when it was initially promulgated. Then, of course, it was changed a couple of times in 2005 and 2014, which means you don't know, you may need to check all three Federal Register dates because you don't know where they're going to discuss what's of interest, but you probably do want to start when it was initially promulgated, because that's when the whole regulation was originally, some of the later FR sites might just cite two brief amendments. The first FR, where it was initially promulgated, will discuss the regulation and its purpose as a whole. So that's now where we can turn to page 17, and sure enough, December 30, 2004. And this also, by the way, available at FedSys, but that's not what I wanted. Let's go back here. And essentially, instead of CFR, here at FedSys, I went to Federal Register and just navigated my way because I knew the date. And as I said, it's organized by date. I don't even pay attention to the volume number, although you do need that for citation purposes. Not quite sure why, but I navigated to the date down to December. And so again, all of these pages are just what I saw on FedSys. So let's take a look at the Federal Register and why it is of interest for regulatory history. So turning to page 18, notice we're at the date that we were referred to, but I'm looking at an earlier page. I am looking at 78,720 rather than 78,778. So 50 pages earlier, and this is the beginning, and basically I found this just by flipping that back to the beginning of where the discussion began by the Department of Labor. And you can see, again, thanks to my handy dandy arrows, talking about 29 CFR Part 2590. So this is where the entire part, not just the section 731, was promulgated. You can see by the second handy dandy arrow that this is a final regulation. So that means this is now part of the law as opposed to a proposed regulation. So you want to make sure you're looking at the final regulation, unless of course you are interested in just the proposed, because you will find proposed regulations and lots of other interesting types of materials in the Federal Register. Notice again, handy dandy arrow, Date, effective date. We talked a little bit about this last time with statutes and taking a look at the parenthetical and making sure we're looking at the date the chapter was enacted as opposed to effective, which can be very different. Typically is different with regard to regulations because typically the agencies will give the affected people who are bound by these regulations some amount of time to get up to speed and actually be in compliance. So this regulation was published in December of 2004. It's effective February 2005. Excuse me, so not a whole lot of time to get in compliance. And then notice the last handy dandy arrow in that column for further information. And granted, this is in 2004, so I'm not sure that this person still works there or that phone number still works. But if you needed to ask a question, it's actually kind of cool, I think, that you have somebody listed right here, published, that you can at least try to give a call and ask a question. Again, who knows if they're still there or the phone number is still accurate. And again, of course, you want to think very carefully before revealing any information about your client or your issue, especially if you're suing the agency. But if you're not, it might actually be a good source for information. And then in the middle column, you see a teeny little handy-dandy arrow pointing at a background. And so here is where the agency starts to talk about why it is they promulgated these regulations. In other words, regulatory intent and history. And you can see some of the language I highlighted to give you that sense. They talk about after consideration of all the comments received. And then we have an overview, and again, the underline, final regulations do not modify significantly the interim rules. So that means that what the justification for the interim rules might be worthwhile looking at too if I really need to dig deep into what the intent behind these regulations are. But it does talk about several clarifications. And turning to page 19, and again, this is more of the same. Pre-existing condition exclusion continues to be defined broadly. So again, giving you the basis for any arguments you might make about how to interpret the regulations. Any questions about why we care about the Federal Register and the concept of regulatory history or intent? Okay, let's turn to page 20. And at long last, notice on the top we get to page 78778, what we were referred to in the source of our CFR section 2590.731. If you look back on the page 16, you'll see that 769 FR 78778, December 30, 2004, and on page 20 is in fact that very page. And on the bottom right of page 20 of the handout, you will see where 2590.731, the actual section, begins. So it says here, section are revised to read as follows. So actually the section was revised, not promulgated. And then you see the actual text of the section, of the various sections. So that, in essence, is why we care about the Federal Register. And actually, in my opinion, the best place to get the Federal Register is what we're looking at here, which is FedSys, because you really, there may be reasons for you to want to do keyword searching in the Federal Register, in which case, yes, you can do it on Lexis and Westlaw. I'm not even sure about Bloomberg. But most of the time, you're going to be using the Federal Register to check the source of a CFR section. And so here, as you can see, it's not too bad to navigate to that section. Oh, I forgot. I brought a little show and tell, and I forgot to show and tell. Well, I told, but I didn't show. So here's what the print CFR actually looks like. And here is the volume for the sections that we are talking about, Title 29 of the CFR and Chapter 25. So parts 2510, 2560, 2590, they're all in here. So I'll pass that around. And And here's what the Federal Register looks like. And what I did was pull off the most recent Federal Register that's on the shelf in the library, which is dated February 27, 2015. The Federal Register comes out every day, well, every business day minus holidays. And as you can see, it still does come out in the print. I'll start this on this side so you can all take a look. And I don't know that you will have a huge amount of cause to ever have to go to the actual print volume because they are on FedSys in PDF, so they look pretty much the same. Yes, some people like to look at the books and have them all open at the same time, and I'm one of those at times. So that may be a reason, but for the most part, you will be either looking on FedSys or Lexis and Westlaw for doing your research with regard to administrative materials. And I did refer to comments. Again, in the Administrative Procedure Act, regulations are required to, agencies are required to publish their proposed regulations, so regulations that they propose to promulgate come out in the Federal Register, and then they are open for, and the notice is provided, and then they are open for comment. And these days, thanks to the web, you can actually now submit comments and read those comments submitted online at regulations.gov. And so you can see comments due soon, newly posted. So I am going to randomly so here's a comment. So here's all about this particular issue, and you would, actually this is a bad example because there were 0 comments received. And you can see how you can narrow it. Let's see if this one has any comments. But essentially you would use this site to search through to identify any comments that might be of interest. Questions?
This is more like a practical matter. So when agencies are actually seeking comments on particular regulations they're trying to enact, is this the only place they would publish them? I know it's not necessarily a research thing, but I guess it sort of is. But I mean, do they actually publish them elsewhere, or is it solely?
That is the source. They may wind up getting published elsewhere. They might be on the agency's website,
Okay.
depending on what the regulations are. They can be reported about in the press. I don't
Okay.
think the entire proposed regulation would be published in the press because that would put readers to sleep.
Correct.
But that is where, from the Administrative Procedure Act, they are required to
I know
publish.
they're required. I was just wondering if they tried to actually gather people involved and actually read it, because I'm sure nobody reads this. You know what I mean? I'm sure the people in the industry.
I don't think they pick up those volumes and read them, but they are aware and will find the proposed regulations probably using FedSys.
Okay.
There are any number of sites that we're not going to go into that allow you to create alerts based on, and actually regulations.gov may be one, I'm not sure, honestly. Let's just take a quick second. There's something called the Unified Agenda. There are a lot of I'm glossing over a bazillion procedural details here, and I'm serious about the bazillion. Regulatory agenda, so there are ways people who are following whatever particular regulatory or issue that is affected by regulations can follow it, especially these days with so much that's available on the web. So as you can see, I mean, I just clicked on this regulatory agenda, and probably, I don't know, again, here there's no place to set up an alert. I know on congress.gov where we were looking, there's a place to set up an alerts, but that's for congressional action, so that's for statutes. So you can see site enhancements, explore new comments. And it looks like they have a Twitter page and, all the social media.
I'm sure they have a lot of followers.
I bet you they do, actually. So I can't answer your question entirely, other than yes, that's where it is. And trust me, the tobacco industry is reading the FDA proposed regulations, or the lawyers.
I understand
tobacco
people are like
industry.
following this, like lobbyists, other people in the industry, but I just mean the general public that might not be aware that this information even exists. It was more just in a general sense than like a lawyerly sense, I guess.
I guess it depends on any individuals or groups' interests. They might become interested and then follow it, perhaps not pulling the Federal Register off the shelf or even going to FedSys and clicking through the dates the way I was showing you, but on a site like this, or probably more likely on organizations, whatever organization that reflects their interest, whether it's, again, people who have thoughts on the Second Amendment, either way, will be members of organization on whichever side their interest is, and would be following whatever the Bureau of Tobacco, Alcohol and Firearms, or whichever order that's in.
ATF.
ATF, thank you. Okay, I think I got that right, good. So they will be, if that's their passion on whichever side, they will be following what ATF is up to, maybe on their organization's website. And of course, I can think of the NRA on one side of the issue. I can't think of a pro-gun control lobby or group on the other, but pardon me?
There are a lot of them.
I'm sure there are a lot of them. So, there are organizations and they keep track, and I imagine that's how, and, of course, Facebook and all the social media and Twitter, and so I'm sure that's how they keep track rather than actually, reading the teeny weeny print of the rather dense Federal Register. Any questions? Okay, one thing we haven't talked about, and of course you won't be surprised that this is coming, is updating, and updating. And yes, you got to do it too. And actually for regulations, it's a little bit more complex. Of course, when we're on Westlaw or Lexis, Westlaw and Lexis will incorporate whatever final rules are promulgated into the CFR. And here on Westlaw, you'll see a currentness link, and we go down, and interestingly, Westlaw is current through March 19th. So they took today's Federal Register, and whatever final rules were issued in today's Federal Register are now in Westlaw. And if we go to Lexis, similarly, although today not as current, although I can tell you when I was looking at this last week, Lexis was more current than Westlaw. So they go back and forth, so I wouldn't judge Lexis, at least on that, but they're current through March 11th. So also obviously pretty current. And let's see, Bloomberg. Come on. Current through March 18th, so Bloomberg's only a day behind. So that's really easy, updating, although Lexis is a week old, so might want to poke around in the Federal Register. Maybe that's an example of when you would want to search the Federal Register on Lexis. Go into the Federal Register and search for whatever your section is or your issue is, and limit it to the last week. However, if you're looking at GPO, and this is why, remember I went here and I pulled down 2015 and I had this random list of titles, spotty, that only go to Title 14. So we took a look at 2014 and we had the complete list. And going through the complete list, I didn't scroll through it so you wouldn't have had an opportunity to notice. You'll notice that the first set of titles, I have this written down because I never remember the numbers, Title 1 through 16, notice they're dated January 2014. Then we get to 17, notice they're dated April. And we go 17 to 27 are dated April, and then we get to 28, which is obviously our title is 29, and that's dated July. And then the last set, 42 to 50, dated October. what happens is the official CFR is updated a quarter of the titles are updated annually. So it's a rolling basis. So in other words, 1 through, let me get these numbers right, 1 through 16 are updated in January, 17 through 27 in April, 28 through 42 in July, and 42 through 50 in October. And you don't have to write that down or remember that. As you can see, I don't remember it. What you do need to understand is that the titles are updated once a year, but at different times during the year, depending on which title it is. So if you are looking at the CFR either in print or officially online, then you do need to worry about updating, because, for instance, we are looking at Title 29, or we're looking and are looking at Title 29 as of July 1st, 2014. Obviously, it hasn't been updated yet for 2015 because it's not July yet, sadly. But anyway, so that means if we're looking at GPO, FedSys, CFR, we need to find out if there have been any changes to whatever sections we're looking at. Now, in the old days, there used to be a system called the List of Sections Affected. And there are actually a whole bunch of pages I put in your handout on the list of sections affected, only because I was afraid my librarian's license would be revoked if I didn't at least tell you this thing existed. And actually, you can look at the list of sections affected online, which is, again, where I got these pages. You can see the link here to the left. The only page I will highlight for you, and then we'll come back to how you really want to do this in a moment. The only page I will highlight for you that, if you can remember, is worth remembering is page 29. In every list of sections affected, whether you're looking in the paper or you're looking online in FedSys, page 2 is going to explain to you how to use it. It's doable, it's involved, it's a little complex, but that's where you would want to. Hopefully you never will have to, because A, maybe you'll have the CFR on your plan on Lexis and Westlaw, and as you can see, at worst, you're a week behind, and then you can just search the Federal Register, as I suggested. Or, better still, the government actually sometimes is with it, and they actually realize what a pain in the neck this is. So what they developed is an unofficial site called eCFR, and you can see right here also, there's the list of sections affected down here, but there's eCFR. And I just clicked on the link, and here's the page, and notice that eCFR is current as of March 17th, so it's only 2 days old. And I wonder if I refresh it, if they've updated it. No, but still, not bad. So I can now navigate to whatever sections I'm interested in. And again, this is totally for free, and I am now up to date as of 2 days ago. And then I could look at the last 2 days of the Federal Register on FedSys to see if there was anything from my agency, which wouldn't be too difficult. So this is why I'm not going into all that crazy detail on the list of section affected. If you're really interested in that stuff, take a look at the handout at home, and I'm happy to answer any questions. But honestly, I would either be on Lexis and Westlaw or eCFR to update, and update. And as you'll see, who has the purple CFR book? What it does, if you do find yourself, for whatever reason, using the print, is it will tell you up front, revised as of July 2014. So that's your clue, is like, okay, again, bibliographic awareness, very important. Okay, here I'm using this source. It's 3/4 of a year old. So I need to do something about that. And as I said, that something is going to the eCFR. Any questions? Again, hopefully much more straightforward than the old days. So things do get better, and actually, courtesy of the government, I think is actually amongst the most straightforward and definitely the most cost effective. And again, there's your in terms of updating, you of course have to worry about whether your regulation got amended or repealed or somehow changed, but you also have to worry about whether or not a court invalidated your regulation. I was telling you about the tobacco advertising regulation that ultimately did get invalidated by the courts some time ago. And again, for that you can, on Lexis and Westlaw, use Keysight for Westlaw, and you'll want to take a look at history and citing references. You can Shepardize regulations on Lexis. And hopefully you would see a signal indicating that there's some sort of status issue with regard to your regulation. And actually there doesn't appear to, you have the case analysis on Bloomberg, but I don't see any reference to B-Site quite yet. Any questions? Okay, so we have a just enough time to talk about, as promised, administrative decisions. Again, these are what are referred to as quasi-judicial functions, meaning they're like cases, they're like litigation-like cases, but quasi in that they're not true court decisions or procedures. Again, they're usually heard by what are known as administrative law judges, judges that are working for the particular agency. Or sometimes just agency commissioners will issue decisions, and these are not, some of these agency decisions aren't so much decisions in terms of two parties advocating against one another. They can be issuances of the agency saying, hey, this is how we're going to interpret this particular regulation. Or somebody might write to the agency and say, hey, I want to do this. Is this okay according to XYZ regulation? The IRS has dozen, if not dozens, of different types of documents that they issue. Now, they're not technically decisions. There are a whole bunch of different names for them, and I'm not going to go into the detail, but private letter ruling, revenue ruling, a whole bunch of different, and then the technical advice memoranda, and I'm not even scratching the surface, but what the IRS is doing is, depending on what type of document it is people will write in and say, hey, is this okay under the various either Internal Revenue Code or Internal Revenue Regulations? And somebody employed by the IRS will write back and say, dear Mr. Smith, sure, this is great, or no, this really isn't that great. Now, that ruling will only apply to Mr. Smith, but lawyers will look for those particular rulings to get a sense of how the IRS is going to react in different situations. And different agencies issue different types of decisions, orders, or a whole bunch of different names for them, but documents to individuals, groups, corporations on how they are interpreting their various regulations. So there's a whole swath of different types of materials. There's an actual decision, in other words, there's a dispute between parties, and then there are these issuance of interpretive, of an interpretive nature. Some, at least for when people have a problem with the agency, sometimes the CFR will actually set forth the procedures. If you have a problem, then you need to do XYZ, kind of like the Administrative Procedure Act or Civil Procedure Law and rules, so sort of a procedural guidelines within the CFR itself. Some of it, I'm guessing, is in the APA. Again, I'm no expert, but I know they do have some general rules. Some of these decisions that are, the decisions that are issued by these administrative law judges when there's a dispute between a person and the agency can ultimately be appealed to the actual courts. And sometimes you'll see decisions revolve around whether they have exhausted their administrative remedies. So in other words, has the person properly gone to the agency and said, hey, you got this wrong, you got to get it right, look. And that's what lawyers are for, because we'll make the arguments about how they got it wrong and look. And then once that's exhausted, then whomever lost can appeal that to the courts, and then it goes through the standard court system. So how do we find all these various types of decisions, opinions, etc.? And the answer used to be it's really, really hard. The answer now is it's not. It's kind of hard, but mostly online. So I'm sure most of you will be happy to hear that. And the first place I will go actually is not Lexis or Westlaw, not only because they're really expensive, and actually the answer also with Lexis, Westlaw, and Bloomberg is it's very hit or miss. The first place I will go is this University of Virginia Library website for administrative decisions. This link is on the Twen course web links. And honestly, if you Google Virginia, you just have to remember Virginia is the main thing. Virginia administrative decisions, this will be up in the first couple of links. And very possibly if you just Google federal or just administrative decisions, it will be close. I haven't tried that, so no promises on that. And what this website does is it just pulls together all the administrative decisions, well, I shouldn't say all, scratch all. Some, possibly many of the administrative decisions that are available on various agency websites and gives you links to them. So this is essentially a portal, but it's nice because they're all over the place and their links here all in one place. And yes, you could just Google and find agriculture decisions, but again, having it in one place is very convenient. And again, the first place I would recommend that you look, and then you, knowing your agency, scroll down, and I am scrolling down to Labor Department. And notice we have the Employee Benefit Security Administration within the Labor Department, and notice there are ERISA advisory opinions. So again, these aren't adversarial procedures, but these are opinions issued by this agent or by this department within the agency having to do with ERISA. And then what I might want to do, now I could search this entire site. The other thing, I'm not exactly sure what I'm searching here with the entire site. Am I just searching advisory opinions? Or I might use my Google site search. And I might just put the word site, and then whatever terms I want to search. And I actually don't know we're going to get anything, but let's see. So we got one. Okay. So that's the first place I would go looking for these administrative decisions. As I mentioned, the agencies may publish them, so you could go to the agency's website and see what you can find there. It's possible you may find some more detailed decisions on an agency website than you find at the Virginia site. You will find some on Lexis and Westlaw, and again, here's where I would caution you to be very careful to find out, is this included in your plan? And there are a couple of different ways you can go on those services, at least here on Westlaw. Looking at citing references, remember we looked at this earlier for possible cases. Well, again, I had pointed out administrative decisions as being something different than cases. Now we've talked about that, so we can investigate and see what's available on Westlaw. And as you can see, they give us, turns out they're referring to some publications within the Federal Register itself. Again, the Federal Register has a lot more than just proposed and final regulations. So you might want to take a look at these. And Westlaw will have for other sections, you will find other types of decisions other than what's in the Federal Register. Lexis really doesn't have a direct link within sections. And honestly, on Westlaw, I don't think I would rely just on that anyway. I would do what I'm about to suggest, what you need to do on Lexis and also on Bloomberg, which is go back to our term search. So I'm just going to do, actually I already, So do our keyword search. Am I just being impatient here, or do I need to go back? I think I'm going to go back and do it here, because then I know it will work. There we go. And of course, we've done this now dozens of times, and we've looked at cases, and we've looked at statutes. Here, if we wanted to do a term search, we could take a look and see what comes up. For administrative codes, as I mentioned, sometimes the keyword search works kind of well, and sometimes it doesn't work at all, especially, plain language or terms and connectors. But what you will also notice we have administrative codes and regulations, so that's what we've been talking about for most of class. There are also administrative materials. And here you get what I think of as a potpourri of different types of documents. And the best way to get a sense is, let's take a look at the filters. So there are a whole bunch of different agencies, as well as federal agencies, as well as state. And then you can see what some of the sources are. So actually, since we know we're interested in the Department of Labor, we might want to filter by that. And actually what we see, documents from that Employee Benefits Security Administration and Office of Administrative Law Judges. So this may be some more adversarial procedures. Benefits Review Board. And actually there's a whole lot more. And going down. So here's that ERISA opinion letters that we were looking at the Virginia site, but some other types of documents here as well. Actually some, I can admit ALJ, administrative law judge decisions. And going back quickly, as I mentioned, the same principle applies on Westlaw. You can look at the citing references for a particular section, or do a keyword search and then use the filters, administrative decisions and guidance. And again, notice they're split up. There's regulations, so that's going to be the actual CFR and state regulations, and then administrative decisions will be here. And again, depending on the cost implications, I would do both. I would look at, on Westlaw, I would look at what particular section citing references there are, as well as do a keyword search for administrative decisions. So that's Lexis, Westlaw, and likewise on Bloomberg. Again, remember with Bloomberg, we need to use our terms and connectors. And, oh, I'm sorry, I always forget. Have to tell Bloomberg to search all legal content. And again, we've done this and filtered it to whatever we're interested in: codes, court opinions, dockets, scrolling down to regulatory and administrative, guidance and interpretation. There's the rules, orders and decisions. So Bloomberg actually divides them up in the filters a little more specifically. And yes, there's nothing to say that I couldn't have started at the tab and narrowed it this way. Again, use your pre-post filter, whatever makes most sense to you. I tend to go for the post-search filters just because that makes sense to me. So again, this administrative decisions, rather hit or miss. Several different sources, some free, some fee. You don't want to forget them. You may not find very much, but you definitely want to take a look and see if the agency is giving you any guidance on how to interpret regulations for your particular issue, or if there have been any adversarial procedures that might shed some light. Even though they don't have precedential value, they certainly might be persuasive if you're arguing before the agency or even before a court. Some of these, if you find them on Lexis or Westlaw, you may be able to Keysight or Shepherd-Eyes. Again, very hit or miss on whether that will work. The only other place, and if you remember, that's great, and have access to it, it's great. If you don't, you will find some agency decisions on Hein Online. So here we are in the Law Journal Library, and you would have to know to go down to US. It's not going to be under A for agency or F for federal. It's going to be under U for US. And then you see the possibilities listed here. So here are some of the titles. And again, also kind of hit or miss. Okay. I'm coming in right on time here. We will continue next time and talk about those presidential documents that I mentioned in the beginning of class. We'll talk about state regulatory as well as administrative decisions, but actually we won't talk very long about them because it works pretty much the same. And then we will do a workshop on everything that we've discussed. So a good part of the class next time will be doing an administrative materials workshop. Any questions? Excellent. Have a great weekend, all.